Welcome back to our course on PSE 2018. In this section we're going to look at keyboard shortcuts. If you don't use keyboard shortcuts you can probably skip this section. If you do, and in particular if you have used keyboard shortcuts in a recent version of PSE, then the keyboard shortcuts generally haven't changed. The main thing to be aware of is that the absence of the help PDF files at the moment means that you don't have the same source of information on keyboard shortcuts that you have had in previous versions. And in this section I'm just going to show you where to find details of the keyboard shortcuts in PSE 2018. So first of all, I'll have a quick review of why people use keyboard shortcuts, and then I'll show you where to find the keyboard shortcuts that you need for PSE 2018. The first question then is, why do people use keyboard shortcuts? For some people it's virtually a necessity. There may be some restriction on the use of a mouse or the use of any kind of pointing device, and they have to use a keyboard to find their way around the screen as well as to execute all of the commands that they're going to execute. This can also be the case for people who have some kind of sight impairment. On the other hand, some people just prefer to use keyboard shortcuts, and very often people who like to use keyboard shortcuts reckon that they are much quicker using just the keyboard than they are using a combination of a mouse and keyboard. On this course I will be using keyboard shortcuts a little, so when doing certain things like copying and pasting I'll often use the keyboard shortcuts, the standard Windows ones. But generally speaking I don't use them for PSE keyboard shortcuts, and there are two reasons for that. The first reason is that you can't actually see my hands on the keys, and it would be very difficult for me to continually keep saying I'm now pressing this key sequence and that key sequence and so on. Whereas if I use a mouse to click on controls on the screen, you can generally see what I'm doing. There is a facility in the software that I'm using to display the keyboard shortcut on the screen, but I think this is distracting, and really what you're trying to do is to see what I'm doing with PSE rather than just following a sequence of keystrokes on the screen. The other reason is that there are actually a lot of keyboard shortcuts in PSE, and I find it a little bit of a challenge to remember them all, whereas using the visible controls on the screen I find much easier. So I tend not to use them for anything that is very specific to PSE. So if you want to use keyboard shortcuts, how do you find out what they are? Well, first of all, in both the organizer and the editor, if you click on one of the menus, where there is a keyboard shortcut, it'll normally be displayed to the right of the name of the function or dialog or whatever it is. So manage catalogs, to bring up the dialog to manage your catalogs, the keyboard shortcut is Control Shift and C. To exit, right at the bottom there, Control Q. Now, as I said, there are a lot of keyboard shortcuts in PSE, and it may be that if you are going to use them, you'll just learn them a few at a time and gradually build up your knowledge of what they are. Up until PSE 15, a great source for consolidated lists of keyboard shortcuts was that pair of PDFs that I've mentioned a couple of times already. In each of those documents there was a list of the relevant shortcuts, and that was a great way of having all that information in two places. Now you can get the same list, but they are within the help system. So if I go to the organizer help first, and from there I go into workspace and workflow, and from there I go into workspace basics, click on select an article, you'll see keys for editing photos, for example. And that gives me a list of the shortcuts for both Windows and Mac. So although that's not in one place, you could certainly print those pages out and stick them together and put them on the wall. That's a great way of getting information about the keyboard shortcuts for the organizer. If I switch into the editor, again click on help, Because if you go to the user guide homepage, from here, if you look right at the bottom of the list of topics, there is a keyboard shortcuts topic. And that takes you to a page where you can choose which particular set of keyboard shortcuts you want to look at. So, keys for selecting tools. And again, it shows you the Windows and the Mac shortcut keys for using those tools. I'm not really going to mention keyboard shortcuts very much more. From time to time I'll just point out some of the more commonly used ones. But if you are aiming to use them, the information is there. It's not quite as neatly consolidated as it was in earlier versions, but maybe if those PSE 2018 PDFs come out, that will help. That's it for this section. I'll see you in the next one.